Okay, look, today we're going to talk about something that's kind of been niggling for a while. It's was the Trump administration going to push on and go ahead with the breakup of Google that had been recommended by a court and by the Department of Justice under the previous administration, under the Biden administration? And look, I don't know about you, Chris, but like everyone rang me and just said, "I guarantee to you this won't happen."
Yep.
Yeah, there's too much resting on it. The president needs a glorious company in Google to succeed. There's no way in the world he's going to kick the foundations out of probably the world's most innovative company and do that. It's just not going to happen. And I'll tell you what really troubled me actually was, did you like every single academic journal I picked up had somebody with some sort of academic credentials telling me that these are 15 reasons from an economic perspective why this can't happen. It all looked very fishy to me. It was like I was
Yeah.
down the fish markets. It was like, this doesn't make sense. And I actually pinged a couple of them and just said, like, who funds your research? You know, didn't get
I
many
can guess.
responses. Yeah, I did. I didn't get an awful lot of responses. And then there was also, I don't know if you saw it, there was also a ton of op-eds suddenly popping up in really big name titles with somebody with a really fancy title like global economic analysis with the whatever it is, something or other foundation,
Yeah.
all saying the same thing. And you go and have a look at them on LinkedIn and you can't really find much. It's all very, very odd. But anyway, look, the upshot of all of this is, of course, that the Trump administration had to decide whether or not it was going to go ahead and push on with the Google breakup. And why don't you break the ice? What happened?
Well, they said we're going to go ahead with it. Basically,
They said hell yes, didn't they?
they said
Yeah.
hell yeah. The only thing, and this speaks to exactly what you said. Everyone was a bit worried that I think that the kind of AI juggernaut would have overtaken this kind of national security AI. We really need investment in that area. Would have changed the kind of mood around the deal and whether it would be prosecuted. And there was the change between the sort of various people who were actually doing the prosecuting. So in the end, they said, hell yes, we're going for it. The only thing was softened is there was a kind of restriction on Google being able to invest in AI, and that was softened to you're going to have to tell us if you're going to. So that was the big change. Everything else was exactly as they'd originally put out in the summer and said, this is what we're going to recommend. And Google have had their chance to come back and say, we don't like it, surprisingly. And also Apple had this big panicky, like
Yeah, no, Apple.
23rd of December. Oh my God. We've suddenly kind of realized we don't like it
Yeah.
either. And both of those were booted out. And so, yeah, it's go. And it goes now to a kind of remedies trial, which probably runs April to August, I would have thought.
Yeah, I'm cancelling my holidays. I'm really looking forward to that one. It'll be absolutely great. I never realised how much I love a court case or some court papers. This has just been absolutely sensational. But look, I think we'll get into what's actually happening and what the breakup is and which bits of the breakup are going to happen. But there's some really big pieces in here, and we shouldn't like gloss over them. So the entire world is in a kind of proxy war around AI and owning the future of this technology because it's a profound change for the world. And so China wants it, Russia wants it, America wants it. I'm sure, the UK definitely wants it. We talked about it last week, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the general, actually, two questions for you. First of all, what's the general sense in the UK about the Google breakup? Do people even know?
Yeah. So, well, I think it's very well known in media circles. Partly because you've got a lot of people. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. I've been working on various bits of this question since probably 2009, 2010. So you've got a lot of people in the industry, in the UK media industry, who've been on it a long time, who've followed it, who kind of understand it. In terms of a kind of a national press thing, crickets. There's nothing.
Yeah, no coverage.
No.
You
Partly,
want
I
to?
guess,
Yeah,
because
you want
it's
to hazard a guess why?
well, partly because it's a US case, but I guess because
Yeah, that'll be it.
it still
Yeah.
sits at the moment in this. We've moved another step, like we've moved through another bit of the snake, but as yet we haven't had kind of a kind of final judgment, and maybe that's when I guess you'll see a bit more of it. But yeah, it's very quiet.
Yeah. So let me give you just talk about the scale of it. So if Google gets broken up, okay, which is what is being recommended by the court and what
Yep.
is being um, agreed, effectively supported by the White House, okay, we're talking about a company that generates, what's its latest numbers? Have you got its latest numbers there off the top of
Three
your head? I
three
think it's at
fifty about 350 billion.
$350 billion of
Mm,
ad revenue. So that's about a third of the world's total ad spend.
mm,
Yeah, effectively gets thrown up in the air. And search used by, well, I saw some numbers. You actually published some of the numbers.
mm,
14 billion queries a day.
mm,
Yeah, it's basically the entry to the internet, right? So this is
yeah.
probably the most fundamental change for people, right? Since I don't know what, like something really massive, right?
Yeah.
Utterly game changing. And you're not reading about it in the news. It's going to change people's behavior 30 times a day.
Mm,
Yeah, because that's what they
mm,
do. They search,
yeah.
and no one's talking about it. Well, what was going on? Has there been an alien invasion or something that I didn't notice?
But I think there is some American news that seems to be taking up quite a lot of the airwaves. the,
But
no, you're right though. It's not really, and even if you read, the traditional kind of campaign, the marketing press. I don't know if it's this ad week and all the kind of other bits. Again, at the moment, I think it's still sort of seen as a legal process that has not reached a conclusion.
you
And I
think?
think it's only if you're watching it really closely do you kind of get a sense that, yeah, because I still think there's a lot of people that think like this is like round seven, but there's going to be an appeal, and in the appeal it will get watered down, and eventually, and also I've always found, I'm sure you found the same thing, that it's actually very the media has not done a very good job of explaining the building blocks of the internet and how this kind of stuff relates to it. And so when you can paint a better picture and say, well, actually, if you think about it, the bits that are being talked about are that Google owns, essentially it has a monopoly of sort of 95%, which means it is the market. It owns the demand and supply side of advertising. It owns not just the search part, but also the browser. It owns one of the biggest browsers. It has done deals that mean it gets almost all of mobile traffic coming, first to its search parts. This sort of sense of almost if you drew the internet in all its component parts and coloured in the bits that Google controls, you'd have a Google coloured internet, and that's the bit that I think has happened. It's happened since 2002, 2004. Gradually, kind of, bits have been put in place, and so it's a bit of a boiling the frog kind of. People haven't really noticed, I think, that's happened. So yeah, maybe that's why it hasn't got quite as much attention as people think.
Yeah. So, so
Mm,
Matt's on, and
mm,
thanks for your note there, Matt. Look, what Matt will have heard me say this 100 times. My view of Google was always that if you imagine every high street in the world with all the shops on every single shop door is a
mm,
bloke in a black coat who takes some money off you every time you try and go in the shop. Yeah. And if you try to go to the library, you have to give him some money for that. And if you want to go to your
mm,
house, you want some money for that. And if you try and get in your car, he's going to
mm,
ask for that as well. So pretty much everything you do and everywhere you turn, everywhere there's a tax that you have to pay something. And that's effectively what Google's done to the internet. And it's not like
mm,
the internet's just another thing. It's not like the internet is like Spotify. You can choose to listen to Spotify, you can choose to do something else. But if you want
mm,
to use the internet, you have no choice but to pay Google a tax, which I think is probably, not the legal definition, but it's certainly the lived experience of
mm.
people that monopoly represents, right?
Yeah.
And so when you decide to try and, yeah, but do you not think so? Yeah,
Well, it
tell me
is
a
a
place on the internet to go that isn't Google, or
yeah,
Google doesn't
but I
get you
think
on the way.
yeah, I do think I also to sort of pause these things to say, look, let's all accept also they have brilliantly engineered the company, right? It has been brilliantly put together. They have some technology which appears seamlessly. So every search in Apple, is headed to Google, but
Yeah,
but you rarely see it because it
kind
just
of
gives
that.
you a search answer in the Apple environment, right? Same thing for Samsung phones, same thing for Android phones, um, and so a lot of the technology is hidden. And from an advertising perspective, you see the ads, but you don't see the process that sits behind it, partly because it's so fast and partly because it's just, again, it's hidden from you. So they've
Yeah.
done a really good job of that. And I mean,
Well,
Matthews,
well,
well, what I mean is they've done a very good job. The point that Matthews made is the job of competition authorities is to kind of encourage innovation up to the point at which it becomes monopoly, which stifles innovation, and then they have to intervene and say, okay, you got too big. You can't blame, in
Yeah,
some ways, you can't blame, the business people behind it for trying to kind of do the best job that they can. But that's why competition authorities exist, is because sometimes there is a winner takes all market where in the end you end up 20 years later with an incumbent, a kind of a legacy incumbent, who has
yeah,
effectively foreclosed every single other point of competition. And that's kind of where we've got to now. So um, not to be
yeah,
melodramatic, but this is a bit part of the reason I don't think people are really aware that really aware of what this could be like is a lot of the people I talk to haven't ever been in an environment in which there wasn't a dominant Google as part of
yeah,
the internet. So
yeah.
that's something that's going to be quite interesting to sort of play out.
I think you're 100% right. So I'm going to name drop here. So I got to speak at the opening of the Melbourne Grand Prix this week. So I've been down in Melbourne, which was truly great. And we were talking about some of this stuff, clearly.
Yeah.
And one of the questions from the audience was, did I think that, this was just kind of an accidental thing, that it's just kind of 1 degree by 1 degree by 1 degree by 1 degree boiled the frog, right? Was that what
Mm,
happened? Or was this systemic, and was it just
mm,
by design? And my response was that probably for about the first 10, 12 years, it was probably
yeah.
just growth. But I think it flipped over into being by design pretty much 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. And it all suddenly just started to be a little bit too convenient. All the little bits seemed to block off all of the opportunities for anybody else. And I came up with a line. I just basically said, look, this whole surveillance technology on the web, that everything is Google and everything gets you, isn't a fault. It's a feature.
Yeah.
It's deliberately built to catch you on all sides. And in fairness to Google, you're right. They've engineered it brilliantly. But
Mm,
similarly, they've also got a responsibility to their shareholders to make as much money as they can. But as we
mm,
said, I think 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago on this, eventually, you're right. Eventually, that wave has to hit a rock, and the rock's going to be
yeah.
the law. And so, the
Mm,
really big question here, coming back to where we started today, was all right, so it's hit the law, and the law has decided that it's an illegal monopoly in its app store, charges too much money,
mm,
30% when most people charge
mm,
1.8% for those kinds of transactions. And then it's a monopoly in search, and it achieved its monopoly in search not by being the best search engine. Okay, it became the best search engine eventually, but it
mm,
wasn't to start with. What it did was it bought all of the traffic from Apple, $26 billion, that deal,
mm,
last number we heard. And
mm,
that gave it all of the web's traffic, which gave it a 91% market share and 97 on mobile. So that was deemed to be illegal. Okay. And then its ad monopoly is currently being decided by a judge, and we should hear back on that fairly soon. And I think that was going to take a very long time, that decision, actually. I think it was going
mm.
to take a lot longer, depending on what happened with this DOJ decision
Yeah.
with the White House. But now the White House has ticked that box, it feels highly unlikely you're going to get guilty, guilty. Oh, by the way, not guilty on this one. It kind of
No,
feels like this is just the bottom of the ball rolling down the hill, right?
yeah, you'd think that they probably wait, not so much for the sort of guilty not guilty bit, but more for the remedies. That
Yeah,
if Google's had to sell Chrome and not do deals and not do this, then almost the start point for the next part is slightly different. But I
yeah,
kind of agree with you. Yeah, I do
yeah.
agree with you.
So let's talk about the remedies. All right. So remedies
Mm.
basically means penalties, basically means punishment, right? So
Yeah.
this is what we're going to do to you for being a monopoly. Remedy sounds
Mm.
so much nicer, right? Lawyers
No,
feel
no,
good
sorry.
about talking
Actually,
about remedies.
let me just
Oh, okay.
let me argue with that. So the reason actually is remedies is because penalties. I mean, the EU loves a penalty. So over the last 10 years, I don't know what it is. It's billions and billions that they find people. But you're talking about some of the most profitable companies on earth, and generally they've just kind of priced that in as a cost of doing business.
Yeah,
So
100%.
the remedies is much more. We are going. You have a structural monopoly, and we are going to to destructure that part. We're going to take it apart, and we're going to make sure that we sort of permanently remove
Yeah.
some of the advantages that you've got. So yeah, it is that's what this
Oh,
kind of
that's
list
fair.
is.
That's fair. So it's kind of a dismemberment. I,
Yeah,
I, I like tougher words than remedy. Remedy feels a bit too
okay.
feels a bit too soft for me for perhaps the
Yeah,
largest fraud in human history. But
it's
other
it's
than
it's a
that,
bit it's a bit honey and lemon.
yeah, it's a bit soft. Yeah, yeah. It's certainly not the delicious By the way,
Mm.
I should always introduce everybody today. I'm back on the Glen Farkless heritage, but I may get bored halfway through and pivot to the Ardbeg, but we'll see. If I start to slur, you'll know what happened. So, all right, let's talk about the remedies. So, the original Biden DOJ,
Mm-hmm.
the way this works in American courts is you arrive, you give your evidence, both sides get to give their evidence, the judge makes the decision, and then the plaintiff, in this case the Department of Justice and about 30 US states, get to send to the court, to the judge, their recommendations on what they think the remedies should be. They actually get to kind of outline what should happen. And the DOJ wrote a truly spectacular, it was one of the best things I've ever seen in terms of explaining what they wanted. They'd clearly spent a lot of time and a lot of brain
Yeah.
power on building it. And it really covered off pretty much everything. And it was, I'm going to forget some of them, but it was, you have to sell Chrome, the browser, which is about 66% of the web's browsing is done on Chrome, 66%. Okay. And then if you use Safari, okay, and you do a search in Safari in the address bar, that's Google as well. All right.
Yep.
So that means that pretty much all of the browser behavior was Google. Then the other penalties were that the ones that really applied to me and to the news industry, the ones I really saw that leapt out at me, was that the second thing was that Google Ad Manager that doesn't really display any data. It doesn't share the data that it has anymore. It kept it hidden. And this was a really big complaint. News Corp and the Daily Mail both testified in court, and I've spoken to both of them about this since. That, you know, the information that they used to get on what's on advertising efficacy, they just didn't get access to that. They were locked out, and it was just slowly sutured to the point where they had very little information. So they had to entirely rely on Google to mark their homework. But then what happened was the number of ads that they received in terms of sell-through and the value of those ads all started to decline. And as a result, they started to see their revenue fall while Google's revenue was rising up 12.5% last year. So one of the remedies is that all that data now has to be made transparent again, like it used to be in the past. There are rules around Google having to release the data that makes search work. So the secret sauce, you know, the Big Mac sauce, this is what's actually in it, and you can make it yourself at home. This kind of gives everybody else a chance to level the playing field on discovery on the web. And I'm really looking forward to seeing, I've had 3 emails actually in the last 2 weeks from people saying that they're now building a browser because they're preparing for what a next generation AI enabled, perhaps a smart browser that knows my behaviors and my preferences might be able to do if it also had access to Google search data. And I noticed that, I didn't notice, it was really obvious. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, who'd spent $100 billion on Bing and got 3% market share, basically said that until this happened, search was the biggest no-fly zone in Silicon Valley for VCs. That was his exact words. And so, like now it isn't. Now people can try and build a better search engine. But there were all kinds of other things. There was a rule that they couldn't invest in AI, which I know we're going to talk about in a second. But the one that really got me was the copyright one, was the one that under the current rules, Google says that if you want to appear in search as a publisher, then your content is freely available to them to train their AI. And if you don't want to train the AI, Gemini, then you just have to disappear from search. That was viewed as tying, which is a legal thing. And so they said you have to separate those two. So a publisher can now say yes to search and no to training, which opens up, for me, feels like it opens a huge market now for trading and bargaining over release of content for the training of AIs.
I totally agree, because it was also, so just to stress on that, it's not just that you can say yes to one and no to the other. It's that you cannot be punished in any way for doing so.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
your search rankings, your search performance, all the rest of it can't be affected by the fact that you've opted out. And it's a lovely term they call it self-preferencing.
Yeah,
which sounds like something you get caught for. So it's basically, you know, and it goes across the whole of the ecosystem. So you can't effectively tie Gmail to to Google search. You can't tie everything off, which has been one of the behaviors that, as you say, probably wasn't so much of a thing in the first 10 years and probably was a really big thing in the second 10. That effectively the kind of the intent of the contract that a lot of publishers signed, certainly to be crawled for search, was I'll let you crawl, you'll give me traffic.
Yeah.
And gradually over the years, that became I'll let you crawl and also use my data for all kinds of other products. And that turned into AI training, that turned into AI overviews, that turned into all kinds of other things. And in return, you'll give me a diminishing kind of share of traffic and try and keep it all on Google. And so that sort of breaking up the ability to just say there's kind of one, you want to be on the internet for search, you have to allow all these other things to happen. That being broken up is a great thing.
That was never the bargain, was it? It was never the
No,
bargain. You and I were there at the beginning of these
yeah,
deals, like 25 years ago. That was never the bargain. The
no,
bargain was clearly understood.
yeah, exactly. And it gradually, the term, as you say, you get to the point where 95%, 90 to 95% market share, it's pretty difficult to renegotiate a deal where you say, well, I'll just move to Bing,
Yeah, that's right. No, you're
try me,
100% right.
So that is a very important thing, and probably speaks also, as you say, to the whole of the kind of copyright debate. It speaks to the whole of um, that sort of contract between publishers and platforms. So that's a great precedent, I think, for a lot of publishers.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. Look, there's quite a few of you now on the call. If you've got any questions or you want to drop in any notes, please do. Chris and I will respond. Chris, I've got a really tricky question for you, actually, something we've not
Sure.
spoken about before. Given that that's happened and they've removed this barrier of tying these two things together, and it creates a new market for selling your content, right? How do you think News Corp feels for the deal it did, or Axel Springer, or do you think any of those guys now feel that? I mean, who knows what's in the terms of those conditions? Those contracts may have had exclusivity in them. They may have had all kinds of things in them. Do you think that they're going to regret having tried to be the canaries in the coal mine here, that they were trying to be first? Do you think there's, or because you've been the CEO, right? You're
Yeah.
the CEO of Bauer.
Well,
If you were back in that chair, would you have waited or would you have gone first? And do you think this changes the negotiating mechanic?
I do think there's a little bit of I don't think News Corp or Springer are great regret companies. I don't think their nature is to look backwards wistfully at the past. In both cases, I think they'd probably say, hey, look, this is like a game of poker that will go on for years. The hand I had 2 years ago, I played it as well as I could. We did a deal for a period of time. Those deals aren't in perpetuity. And they set a precedent that there could be a contractual arrangement between a publisher and an AI company. They set a precedent that platforms could pay publishers. They didn't, maybe they'd look back and say they didn't really set the precedent that was legally required. They said it that it could be commercially done. But I don't think there's any doubt that there's more money flowing between platforms and publishers outside of just the commercial kind of deals that they do now than there was 5 years ago. So I think they'd probably look at it that way and just say, there's the next deal will be informed by it, and this is going to be an ongoing question. I think probably interestingly, when those deals were done, which is what 2 years ago, 3 years ago, probably.
Well, I think news was last year.
Yeah. So even then, I think the copyright question, certainly in the UK, the copyright question wasn't quite as stark. It was sort of seen as something that would sort itself out probably 2 years ago. I think that's really, particularly domestically here, it's really been brought into kind of sharp focus by the government's consultation. And what's really been stark about that is that the government is mulling over whether to sell the kind of creative sectors down the river.
Yeah, you should give us an update on that. We talked about this last week. Some of you were on the call, but what's happened this week? Because I mean, it's pretty fast moving, right?
Yeah. So there was so the government's basically got they said that they'd had 11,000 responses, which for a public consultation is a huge amount.
How many of them came from you?
Mine was very short. It just said "obs." So they've got to read through those. I think they've been it's going to go another round. So 11,000 things. They've got to come back, summarise them, come back again to Parliament. Having said that, I don't think so. So I thought the kind of there was a big push from the industry to say, let's take this seriously. The conversations coming out subsequently from the government, I don't think have been particularly different from the ones they were having before, which is we need to get to a settlement, but we don't want to disadvantage AI. And as we said before, Keir Starmer is working very hard. We just took a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium, as it is called, not aluminum, as the tariff said.
Yeah.
And that's been pushed now into a trade deal negotiation. On the table in that trade deal negotiation, undoubtedly, is digital regulation. It will be one of the things that the American kind of delegates will push very hard for, to say we don't want any kind of regulation that we don't already have at home. And the UK question is, will the government be able, under the conditions that conversation will take place in, to be able to kind of find a decent footing for the UK's kind of industries? And we don't know that yet. So yeah, no real update. Someone somewhere is chewing through 11,000 responses, or they're feeding it into AI to do it. The funniest story this week is I don't know if you saw this yet, but the guy who's like the minister who's sponsoring this consultation, Peter Kyle, had a freedom of information request for someone to take all of his Chat GPT prompts, and it went through.
I wish I thought that. I thought that.
I thought you'd like that. So someone somewhere is looking through all of his, what's he actually been asking ChatGPT. So note to everyone on the call: if you work in a regulated industry, your prompts may be subject to freedom of information access requests.
On the subject of freedom of information, this has apropos absolutely nothing really with this conversation, but it's quite astonishing. And I'm not going to name them. An American, very, very wealthy and well-known tech leader in America has bought a massive chunk of land in New Zealand and has put in an application to basically build a doomsday bunker. Okay. And this has been turned down by the local authorities. They've said that you're not allowed to build a kind of 5-story underground doomsday bunker in our small, beautiful community by a lake. But in the application and in the letter from the lawyer for the planning application, it explicitly talks about the time that it would take him in the event of a nuclear strike on San Francisco to be able to get from his house to the airport to his plane, the speed of his plane to outrun the blast radius, and the likelihood of him being able to get to New Zealand. And that was part of the justification for him wanting a planning permission, because it was the only way he'd be able to survive the nuclear strike. No joke.
It's a very unappreciated skill, layer planning.
And this was his planning application. It used to be, look, my neighbour's fence is obscuring my view, and I need to build myself an orangery. Now I need an 8-story doomsday bunker outside the blast radius. Oh my goodness me! All right, so there was one thing that changed between the Biden era remedies and the Trump era remedies. Why don't you explain?
Yeah, sure. So it was there was originally a kind of if you think of all this sort of productizing, vertical stack, we own all the bits of all the bits. There was originally a kind of thing that Google could not invest anymore in AI, because obviously
let me stop you there and just ask, why do you think that was there? What's your theory as to why they put that in the original DOJ?
I think it was essentially, so this is if you come at it from, if you're a competition lawyer, you're constantly in this kind of sense of am I kind of creating innovation? Is the current monopoly having what they call a chilling effect on innovation, investment, and the next generational wave of kind of spontaneous industry which creates value in ways that a monopolist basically prevents? That's flowery language, but that's basically what they're looking for. And so I think what the original intent was kind of say, look, you guys you've got a position. They've poured money into Anthropic is the Google investment.
They've got money in Perplexity as well, but it's mainly Anthropic.
Yeah, so they piled money into that, and I think the kind of view at the time was, there's going to be a wave of disruption, and you guys can't just buy your way over the top of that. I
Yeah,
think there is very clearly at the moment the AI wave is one of the very few kind of technology innovations where the disruptors are the incumbents more than they're a completely new set of people. So I
hmm
think it was designed to break that. And then that was the bit that seemed to kind of hit this political, well, hang on, there has been a change between Biden and Trump on, general kind of the urgency and the national security implications of AI. For those of you that read these, OpenAI's letter about copyright essentially says, hey, look, I love copyright, but the Chinese will get there first if we don't abandon it. And so this kind of whole national security kind of
Hang on, sorry, I've just got to wipe this tear off my eye just for a second.
yeah, so that's what changed, and so it was softened to part of the remedy then is if Google wants to invest in AI, it needs to kind of come to the competition authorities and say this is what we're going to invest, and for them to say okay, that's fine, or to
Yeah.
say whoa.
So I don't know if you saw that Microsoft is back in the crosshairs of the antitrust people this week. So
Mm,
the FTC, it warned actually about November last year. It kind of dropped a bomb on Microsoft and basically said, "Hey, look, we're probably going to bring a case against you. We're going to ask a whole load of details," and sent some lawyers to their offices and took some papers away.
mm,
And they confirmed that they're pushing forward with this. And one of their main complaints is that Microsoft invested a huge amount of money in OpenAI, $13
mm,
billion dollars, to own 49% of the business. But it didn't take a board position. And so it didn't alert the authorities when it made the investment. Now, normally, under normal, I'm going to use the pub test, the Australian pub test.
mm,
You
yeah,
would normally think that if you're spending $13 billion of shareholders' money on acquiring a company on a whim before AI is really being much talked about, that you would tell the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC,
yeah,
which is what
yeah,
you're supposed to do when you make a major transaction that affects the impact of your value of your company. You would probably tell the SEC, but they didn't tell the SEC at all because they didn't really take it's kind of a little bit airy fairy. They didn't really take an ownership. They kind of didn't go on the board, but they do have control. And so
yeah.
this, yeah, you remember this?
Yeah, I was going to say because it's a not for profit at that point, isn't it? So
It
again,
wasn't
it's
not for
slightly,
profit.
yeah.
That was
So
part of their argument.
yeah,
Yeah, but it's worked out to be very profitable for Microsoft, which has basically
mm,
added about $700 billion worth of value since it did the deal, largely on the
yeah,
back of its excellent work with Copilot, which is pretty much built or was built on OpenAI. And so they're
mm,
now in the crosshairs as well. And then let's be clear, we've got an antitrust trial with Meta kicking off on the 14th of April, which is demanding that they are separated from Instagram and WhatsApp. No one's
mm,
talking about that. Okay.
yep,
We've got an Amazon antitrust trial due to kick off in about a year. Well, it's just over a year. Okay.
mm,
Which aims to break its control on retail. Okay. $570 billion, $175 billion worth of revenue in retail they're trying to crack open. You've now got Apple is facing one on privacy, which I'm quite certain, I've read the complaint, is going to argue that all of Apple's TV ads about we're privacy, your iPhone is private. No one knew that your iPhone was basically running on Google once you used the
yeah,
internet and all that
yeah,
information went to Google and Google used it. So that privacy claim, when you're paying $1,800 for a handset, I'd like to know the difference between whether
yeah,
or not it's a Google handset in disguise. I'd like to know that. And then we've also got the Microsoft one now. So there really is big change coming in big tech. Well, how
yeah.
profound do you think this is going to be, or do you think it's just going to all
Well,
just kind of fall in a heap, or do you think it's all going to change?
no. I mean, I think it's I think it's necessary because I mean, much as they have become, we they're big tech, but they're also legacy tech. These companies are 20 years old. They're in very dominant positions in very stratified markets. They do stifle innovation. There is
Mm.
no doubt, as you've said, that if you can have people say, look, no one's going to invest in search or in browsers or in these areas because they're locked up. You try launching, what you watch kind of what's happening with something like a Blue Sky or whatever. Trying to launch a social platform is very, very difficult. And so all of these things, it feels like an industry that needs that kind of just to stimulate competition and to take away some of the entrenchment that's there. And the kind of the competition authorities, I think have been relatively slow to get there. They're
Yeah,
probably, I mean, there's a great book for those of you that like a thick read. There's a great book called The Wolves of K Street, which I would highly recommend, which is all about the lobbying, how lobbying kind of developed in Washington. And it talks about there being in 2008, 2009, a conversation with Biden's FTC, kind of competition authorities, to say, look, do we have to do something about Google because it's becoming too powerful? And at the point that they got to it and then went, nah, actually they're doing great things for the country, and they were in the White House, and the whole case kind of went away, and it's seen as one of the great triumphs of lobbying. To your point, right at the start of the call, one of the things they invented at that point was how you get academics, how you get people to write articles about this is really a great kind of technology company, and we should be backing it. This is exactly the playbook that you're seeing now around not just Google, but also just the AI kind of companies. So,
yeah,
this has been coming for a long, long time, and so I think it naturally kind of working its way through the process. And as the US is one jurisdiction, the EU, the UK, Australia are also looking at the same thing. Every single one of these cases builds on the shoulders of the previous one. So the remedies that are put in place for Google set a precedent as to the kind of one of the appeal points that Google will have is, is a very technical kind of point about, you caught me doing this, you can't then punish me like this. Like,
yeah. I've seen that.
you caught me in this bedroom, you can't stop my access to the kitchen. That's not how it works. All the lawyers on the call are just rolling their eyes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But that's essentially that one of their appeal points. So coming
That's why you
alongside,
don't earn $2,000 an hour.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And it's necessary, and it will still take a while to unwind, but the internet will be a better place for it.
yeah, I agree.
And
100% agree with that.
that kind of sense of having a route to market for entrepreneurs, for small businesses, for innovation that does not have to play by the rules of one of 4 or 5 platforms. Mobile, essentially, if you think about one of the remedies, so let's just talk a little bit about the kind of Apple deal remedy. So this is essentially Google, at the point that the iPhone kind of came in, they'd done a deal with Apple as far back as 2002 and said, we want to be a search engine that can work on your platform. When the iPhone came out, that deal started to become a rev share deal. But when they signed the deal 2015, 2016, it was a 10-year deal that neither side could exit. That paid Apple in last year before, I think it paid Apple $20 billion. And in return,
26 in
was it more?
2022. Yeah.
And in return, 95% of iPhone traffic search queries go to Google. And so if you think about the iOS world, that 95% that's going to Google. Android, Google. They did a deal with Samsung, Google. And suddenly you have essentially locked up mobile internet. And that means that no other company can kind of break into it. They're just no consumer is getting a choice about that. It's all behind the scenes. It's all locked up in exclusivity deals, and that unraveling, as you say, does let new entrants think about different ways of getting to the internet in ways that we haven't done for 2 decades. So I think it is
100%.
generationally transformational.
Stephen, I'm going to get to you in one sec, but just before I do, I just want to share an anecdote. So I became the head of digital for News Corp in London on the 1st of January 2020. So I literally started, 2000, 1st of January 2000, the first day of the millennium, I became the head of digital. Talk about like an apocryphal moment. It's kind of like, here's a whole new 1,000 years to go after. And oh, by the way, at the same time, we've got this whole new thing called the internet. Why don't we just go and build it from scratch? Here's a crayon, then there's a wall, go, sorry. And so many opportunities, and we did so many things. We were innovating something new every 2 days. And I think we said on our very, very first call on this, when we were talking about, I said, I sold my very first display ad on the website of the News of the World in London, and I sold it for £26,000 for one day, which is as a CPM, bearing in mind the
It's not
internet was
bad.
brand
Yeah.
new. Yeah, it's kind of about 30-40 million pound CPM or something.
Yeah.
It was a good deal. I should have stayed in sales, clearly.
Yeah.
But we had the opportunity to build absolutely anything we wanted in any direction, okay, at the time. And we just haven't had that opportunity for a long time. And I often do sit back and wonder just what search would be if Google hadn't been a monopoly. If there'd been an opportunity to be competition, what would advertising be today? Would
Mm.
newspapers really have all gone to subscription and denied news to 80% of the public that can't afford it? What would the internet have been if it had truly been a digital democracy rather than a
Mm.
kleptocracy? I'm really quite tortured by that. That really bothers me. Anyway, look, let's get back to Stephen. So Stephen's asked a really good question because I actually dealt with
Mm.
this just the other day in Canada. So I'll read what he said. He said, the large companies have an advantage. Perhaps we just need to tax them more so that the cash surplus that they have isn't so disposable for the next arms race. If you
Mm.
have enough to throw at AI or the metaverse and lose billions of dollars ahead of everybody else, perhaps governments could use some of that money for things like health or education. Now I'm just talking silly. All right, so I've got a very real world answer to you on this one. So I've been, for some obscure reason, I've been very, very, very involved in Canada for the last couple of years. Many, many, many local publishers and national publishers there contacted me for help and advice. And it was because we'd had the news media bargaining code here in Australia, and Canada was copying it. And people wanted to understand what the experience of the news media bargaining code had been. What were the potholes? What were the wins? What
Mm.
were the losses? What could be learned? And so I spent a lot of time talking to the government there and talking to various organizations there and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of publishers. And one of the things that happened was that Canada brought in its Online News Act, which was very similar to the News Media Bargaining Code, had some subtle differences, but it's more or less the same concept, which is that if you use news content, you have to pay for it. Okay, it's
Mm.
simple, really. But what then happened was that Meta pulled out altogether from publishing news links in in Canada, and it's still the same. So if you are a news site, you're not allowed to have a site on any Meta platform. And if one of your links is posted by another user, it's deleted by the Meta AI. So it's a deliberate and very determined shutdown of access
Mm.
to news. It's not an accident, it's deliberate, it's a
Yeah.
punishment. How
Yeah.
dare you? I am indignant. I am shutting off access to my audience. Now, what happened when that happened? It happened right in the middle of a really serious series of wildfires in Canada. And people had no way to get information from the authorities because they were giving the information to local papers. Local papers were trying to post it. It was being deleted. And so lots of people were put in great danger. And so the Canadian government issued a moratorium on advertising on Meta. And I can't remember the exact number. It's about 78 million a year, something like that.
Mm.
Can't remember the exact number. And that stood for 2 years, okay? And it was really the Canadian government just saying no, all right? Just
Yeah.
not happening. I think New Zealand did the same thing after Meta live streamed one of those atrocities a few years ago.
Mm.
Anyway, this had stood in place in Canada for a long, long time. When the Trump White House issued sanctions or tariffs on the Canadian government the other day, within 24 hours, the Canadian government had dropped and had started paying advertising into Meta again.
Mm.
And I was asked by lots and lots of publishers, what do you think? And my response was really simple. If you take a taxpayer's dollar, okay, and then you give it as a Canadian, as the Canadian government, you give a taxpayer's dollar to Meta, that dollar leaves Canada, goes
Mm.
to Ireland, where they bank, where Meta banks. It then pays minimal tax, and then it eventually lands in the coffers of Meta, and it's never, ever, ever, ever coming back to Canada ever again.
Mm.
And so, if you're, to your point that was just made here in the questions,
Mm.
if you're a taxpayer, do you really want your money going to a country that you're stuck in a trade war with? And secondly, do you want the money, which, by the way, will turn out to be billions of dollars? Here in Australia, it's $5 billion of taxpayers' money leaves Australia to go to Meta, and 10 billion goes to
Mm.
Google. That money's never coming back. And that's enough for a hospital. That's enough for a school. That's enough for
Yeah.
all of these things that we're talking about here. That feels like somebody needs to wake up. The public need to wake up to this and recognize just how toxic that is.
Well, so the UK has the same. So it is a great question because the UK tried to solve it by putting in the EU the same, this kind of digital services tax. which was kind of the recognition that actually, if you're operating here, but you're repatriating the profits there, then we're not really getting any tax return from that. So there was a kind of a 2% tax that was put on digital services to say some of that's got to stay here, basically,
Yeah.
and because it's our market that is essentially the revenue source. And again, that's on the list. It's explicitly on the list of. It's one of the things that JD Vance talked about. When he was talking about taxes and regulations, unfair prosecution of American companies. So it is a really good question that's been asked because, and again, that's been 10 years. I mean, Jesus, I remember Gordon Brown, who many of you will not remember, but Gordon Brown. So that must be 10, 15 years ago. Trying to kind of rally the G7 to say, look, how are we going to tax multinational companies? It's I suspect because a lot of them are going to be American companies, that will be something that the current administration will see as an act of hostility rather than a sensible realignment.
When we sit down and talk about these things, there's so much going on. There's so many angles. It's like it's really difficult to stay on the ground. It feels like you're going to spin off and gravity's not going to hold you and you're going to be off into space. But it does really come down to some fairly short fundamentals, I think. So who owns the internet is really the first question. And I think Google and America genuinely think they own it. Yeah. And I don't think that that's right. And I think that's probably how you feel, because the boiling frog for us is the same as the boiling frog for them. But because they're working in it every day, I think they own the internet. And we said on a call, didn't we? And I think it was our second call. I basically said the clue is in the name. It's the World Wide Web, not the American Wide Web. Okay. Yeah. And so it is global. Okay. So that's the first thing. And I don't think China's ready to hand it over. And I don't think India's ready to hand it over. And so we may see a splinternet. We may see an internet where America gets so aggressive about protecting the boundaries of what it does. It says, do you know what? You can't have OpenAI unless you're an American. We're going to take our toys away and it's just an American thing. And we're going to use it for American supremacy for America. And I'm sorry, but you just can't have it because you haven't paid enough tax and you're not playing nice and we're not playing. We're taking our toys home and we're locking the garage door. There's a chance that might happen. And then you're going to end up with a European web, you're going to end up with an American web, you're going to end up with a Chinese web. We already kind of have a Chinese web, but we already have a Russian web. So this isn't a completely ridiculous idea. We might end up with that. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the huge changes is it's gone from being essentially a kind of a distribution channel to being the market. And so, one of the things about digitization has been so when you start
exactly right.
So when you started out, it was a new channel, and you could do things digitally, and you could do things in other markets, in other channels. Now we're getting to the point where, like, if every technology is essentially distribution is digitized, then the internet is the market, and so all of the kind of behaviors that have been traditionally kind of worried about by things like competition authorities and national security and all the rest of it that related to national economies now are getting kind of sort of transcribed across to the internet, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. But the idea that you kind of, in some ways, the idea that you can sort of construct it's a fun kind of thought experiment. If you try and think about how would you construct take New Zealand, right? New Zealand says, well, we're going to have our own. Puts walls up around, its internet. It's a very, China's done it to some extent, and Russia's done it. And the lesson probably from that is if you want to have a closed internet, you need first to build a fully authoritarian state. And that's quite a high price to pay. For everybody else, you would think that a kind of a worldwide system where competition was fair would be what you'd aim for. But again, that's if you're in a world where free trade is the dominant economic kind of view of the world. If isolationism and sort of separation into trading blocks is the way that the world economy goes, the internet will follow because it is the market. That's right. My view.
I think that's 100% right, and beautifully put, by the way. In about what would it have been? 2018, 2019, 2019. My wife's on the call, so maybe she can remind me. Um,
Mm,
I had a conversation with the French competition regulator. And it's a long story as to how it came about.
mm,
But I was basically asking about, for any of you that may have gone to France way, way, way back in the 90s and in the very early 2000s, the way that you accessed the internet mainly was that there was like a device on desks. And you could go and you could type questions into it and you get an answer. And it was all run by the French. And it was a French search engine. And I've totally forgotten the name of it. It will come back to me. But the competition regulator said, "Look, we think this is actually a better model than the model we've got. We think there should be a French internet, and we think that French companies should get preferential traffic on a French
mm,
internet, and they should get preferential ad rates if they're domiciled for tax in France. And we should, as a government, maybe move all of our ad money only to companies that are domiciled here, and then we
mm.
can build a digital economy of our own." Which basically means we cut ourselves off. And I said to them, "Okay, well that's really interesting. What happens about search?" And I said, "We can build a search engine. That's no problem." And I said, "What about social media?" And they look, honestly, he looked me right in the eye and he just went, "That's a criminal matter and we'll be dealing with Mr. Zuckerberg." So they weren't pulling punches, right? But he delivered it in a French accent. And it sounded
Yeah,
so much more elegant
yeah.
than what it was, which was a deep, cold threat. "Don't come to France anytime soon on holiday, Mr. Zuckerberg." They were clearly after him for damage that he'd done to young people in
Mm,
France,
mm.
And so it could very well be that we see, yeah, to your point, the internet just follows this kind of sudden protectionism. See, I guess a global market has worked for years until a prize the size of AI happens.
Yeah,
And then people go, or maybe it's got something, well, it's probably a bit of that, and it's probably a bit of declining empires and changing power in the world system. All of these things kind of
yeah.
combining together just mean that a global internet and a global economy don't make sense. And the whole concept of globalization fractures.
I'm not. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not. I'm always optimistic that it's not that in the end, but it is a realignment, and there has to be a period of friction. There has to be a kind of period of people working out that this is. There actually needs to be a kind of a settlement and an understanding. So one of the things that has to be settled is for example this conversation about. I mean, maybe this is a topic that we have to pick up for it because it will be a long conversation. But free speech as a kind of policy weapon
Yeah.
is one of the things that just has to be agreed that can you both insist that as part of trade deals can you insist that sovereign states not only adopt your technologies but adopt your free your views of what free speech is and your regulatory oversight levels if they want access to X, Y, Z. Is that something that national states are prepared to do? My view would be in time, no, they won't. But that someone has to actually go through the process of doing that, and that's probably what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
AI
I
is
think
interesting. I was talking to someone from Germany in the week, and I was saying I think it's going to be very interesting for the Germans and the French and all of the European countries who've been slightly protected from some of the conversation that we're having, protected by language. They haven't had to compete with English language markets as the UK definitely has done. Australia, New Zealand definitely does. Canada the same, and they've been slightly protected by language, but AI doesn't come with those protections. So
mm,
there's going to need to be a kind of that's why the French are investing so heavily in Mistral and trying to have a kind of domestic
yeah.
AI
And why
industry.
the UK is investing
Yeah,
so much in protecting its
yeah, yeah,
AI there.
yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. All right.
And,
So
and,
I
and
can
also,
see.
sorry, it also goes back to Stephen's tax point, which is if you don't have a domestic industry, you don't have a domestic tax base. And if we're saying that the internet is the economy, and you don't have a tax base in there, and you have an aging, you can see governments sitting with a whiteboard going, "So I've got an aging population, heavy kind of government spending liabilities, and no tax base in the future economy. This is a problem. So
Yeah, it
that
feels
has
like a
to shake
problem, doesn't it?
itself out." Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think
So
I don't know if there's any economists on the call, but I think that's a problem.
yeah, I think that's a problem, right? So far we're better than the lawyers and we're better than the economists, but we're doing pretty well. We should run for government. So
Mm,
I So your point about it being a requirement for other nation states to adopt some of the cultural norms or the convenient norms, I think would be a
Mm,
better way of putting it, of other countries to be allowed to play with their toys is an interesting one. See, I don't think
mm,
the internet ends if America ends. I don't think the internet ends if America decides to make its own internet in America, right? I don't think that that will be fatal for the rest of the world. I think the rest of the world will suddenly discover incredible creativity. I think it would actually be quite lovely for that to happen in the same way as I think that breaking Google up will actually be a good outcome for Google products. I think YouTube will become
yeah.
something truly marvelous if it could just get out from underneath the rock of Alphabet. So I do think there's opportunities in breaking things up that shouldn't necessarily be frightening, but they should actually be viewed as an opportunity for people that have innovation. I said again on stage down in Melbourne the other day that monopoly is a problem because no one else can play. Chaos
Mm,
is scary, but at least you've got a chance to play in chaos.
yeah.
I'd take chaos over monopoly any day. Yeah,
Yeah.
because then you have a chance.
Well, never let a crisis go to waste, right? This is the kind of this is the period in which, as you say, I'm very bullish on some of these things will create big fissures, and I'm very bullish that the level, the speed and skill at which the internet and the digital market can innovate will fill most gaps very quickly. So
Hmm.
and I think what will get built will you're talking in some cases about, say, 20-year old established kind of companies. What will get built, hopefully, will be, rather than this sort of slightly oligarchic setup that we've got now, will be much more dynamic, competitive, based on businesses that are growing from a smaller, medium-sized base.
Yeah,
Funded by a lot of the capital that's available to do that, which won't be spent on this area of the internet right now because you cannot outcompete, the structural monopolies that are there. So I'm really bullish on it. It just has to go through this period of, as you say, what feels slightly chaotic and awkward and difficult to get your head around. But yeah, these things are stepping stones to, I think, a much more competitive and brighter future.
yeah. All right, I've got two last things I just want to talk about. The
Mm,
first one is a comment. The second one is a question. So the first one is that I did some work recently in reading the free trade agreements that exist between America and Australia. It was a thrill, absolute thrill
yeah.
ride. Like the first 108 pages were
Mm,
great. And then I had a look
mm,
at the free trade agreement that exists with Mexico. I had a look at the one in Canada. I haven't had a
mm,
look at the one in the UK yet, but I will. There's a really interesting clause that's in all of them, about 180 pages in. It says something like, I'll find the exact words for next week, but
mm,
it says something like, by adopting this free trade agreement, you are signing up to, you will not do anything by choice that will impact on the ability of American companies to operate successfully within your or competitively within your
yep.
country, something like that. And it's one of those wonderful grey areas that tech companies absolutely adore. And what it
Mm,
clearly says is, what it's clearly saying without saying it is, fair use means that we can use anything we want, and your concept,
mm,
your ridiculous 300-year-old concept of copyrights isn't going to work for us. So we're going to
yep.
ignore that. And by the way, this Section 230 thing as well, you're not going to prosecute any of our companies for publishing libelous or defamatory
Mm,
stuff in your country. You're just not going to do that because that's not something we have in our country. So we're not going to allow that. And so when you said earlier on that, that you're going to see this being dropped into various trade deals and
yeah,
new
yeah,
tariff restrictions, all this kind of stuff, 100%. It might even be that this is the cake in which the knife is hidden. Yeah, the
yeah,
tariffs is the
yeah,
cake, and the knife is in the cake. It's kind of one of those. So that was the first thing I was going to say. The second, and we'll find out. But the second thing I wanted to ask you, and it's a cracker, because it's an absolute zinger. It's almost impossible to answer. But I'm going to let you have a go because Paul Hood's on the line, and there's a
yeah,
whole load of other media people on the line. So, mate, you're back in your CEO chair again.
yeah.
All right. It's Thursday morning. You've got a board meeting, Friday, 3 o'clock. Okay. You've had 25 of those black coffees. You're all
Mm,
over it, right?
yep.
They say to you, right, come on, Chris, what are we going to do about this AI thing? Go. What do you do? What do you say?
Run like hell.
I'm going to drink
As
this
as
and
in,
leave you to it. Go.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, say run like hell in the sense of you've got to adopt it. You've got to understand it.
was that was that
You,
was
you
that resign? Run like hell.
no, 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 no. I thought it
I
sounded that.
quit.
Yeah, run and hide. No. So firstly, you have to be an adopter. So you've got to
Yeah,
build it into all of your kind of production processes, your newsrooms. You want to be as a media company a fast adopter of new technologies. You have to understand, I think, from a licensing perspective, that right now there is a period of time where you need to establish the fact that you have the capability to do licensing deals, and understand what it is that you would license and how you would actually operationally kind of run as a syndication licensing business. You need to understand, I think you need to have a really clear kind of public affairs um, point of view, and an understanding that, I mean, it's a really strong understanding that the people that you are going to be competing with for the government's attention are investing millions of pounds in their public affairs, positions, and the papers that you're seeing, that all of that kind of, they're very, very skilled at that side, and
yeah,
so you have to kind of understand that from a creative sector, from a publishing industry, you want to be part of strong trade bodies. You want to make sure that you're providing a kind of you want to be a unifier, I'd say, at this point. And I think you're going to have to spend. I mean, I would be saying we need to spend a great deal of time kind of in um, scenario planning sessions where we really think about what are the implications of some of these building blocks being moved. We're out of the habit of really thinking about, like, so, I mean, I know we've talked about this before, but if Google's got to divest Chrome, should we buy it?
oh my
Um,
god, of course we should. Yeah.
these are questions that we should be thinking about, because every time you really go and look at those questions, you'll find out that there's something that you understand a bit better about your position in the businesses. And your last point, actually, which is, you started off sort of saying this Google deal's come about and there's almost no reporting on it. But the media, I think, has to probably, I would be saying at this point, we part of our public affairs capability is explaining this kind of debate, the impact on tax, the impact on the way that our society functions, the impact on all these things, our future economy, explaining that to each of our kind of relative publics. And I'd
Yeah,
want that
well,
done. I'd want that done for Monday morning.
jolly good. Well, you can do that because you're the CEO, right?
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, look, that's a lot we've covered there. Thanks everyone for coming along. We're on the hour. I'll call it a day. But look, we'll be back again next Friday at the same time.
Yep.
Don't know what we're going to talk about then. Somebody's going to have moved on. It seems to be a fairly fast-moving piece. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think so. And if anybody has anything they particularly want to get into,
That's a
do stick it
good.
in the questions. Stick it in the questions,
That's
or you know where we are.
get hold of us on
Yeah,
LinkedIn and send us what
yeah,
you want to talk about.
yeah.
We're across most of this stuff, so we'd love to help. It's been great. Thanks everyone for coming along. Hey Philip, I'm very sorry you've just arrived right at the very end, mate. But
Don't,
we will post this and you
yeah.
can find it. All right, let's get after it. All right, thanks
Have a good
everybody.
weekend.
Great to see you. See you. Bye bye.